Hello, I'm Jonathan Charnes. Thank you for watching my video, The Dysfunctional FAA Part 1. I'm a Gold Seal flight instructor, instrument and multi-engine, flight engineer on a Boeing 727. I have Boeing 737-200 airline transport license, former airline pilot, Part 135 and 121 experience, former FAA accident prevention counselor, former physics teacher and chemistry teacher. Currently, I'm acting chief flight instructor at an FAA Part 141 school. I have noticed primarily three types of FAA inspectors. One, there's the true professionals who are a credit to the FAA. They help make air travel safe, and they're a pleasure to work with. Unfortunately, the FAA often gets rid of these inspectors for doing their job. At least three warned their supervisors at Washington National Airport, well, Reagan Airport now, about the dangers of helicopter collisions before the Army helicopter collided last January with a commercial airline flight. Rather than working to remedy the dangers that the controllers told their supervisors about, they were simply removed from their duties at Reagan. Could this be considered criminal negligence or manslaughter by their supervisors? Another FAA inspector wrote up a captain and first officer on a Boeing 727 night flight for alternately falling asleep on different legs of the flight. She wrote him up for reckless endangerment. The company said that if it was dangerous, why didn't she get off on the first leg after the plane landed instead of continuing on several other legs? And naturally, the FAA sided with the company and moved this inspector to inspect American Airlines flights instead of our cargo company's flights. Another type of inspector is what I call the DEI. They were only hired for diversity, equity, and inclusion reasons. These inspectors often lack the experience and knowledge to perform their duties as an air carrier inspector or maintenance inspector. One example is when I called the FAA hotline and warned them of a false on-course signal I was getting from my navigation radio. It was a Narco Mark 12D. It showed that the plane was exactly on course, even though it was in excess of 30 degrees off course, and there was no warning flags to show that there was an improper signal. When I brought this to the attention of the avionics inspector, he said, just bring it to an avionics shop, have them evaluate it. I suggested, since the problem's intermittent, what if I just put some strings on the different wires that lead to the indicator and tug them while the plane's flying to give me an idea which one might be the culprit. He said, yeah, if I do that, he'll ground the aircraft, even though there's no justification for grounding an aircraft because a navigation receiver is not working properly. In any case, I did bring it to an avionics shop, and they basically did the same thing as I did, except on the ground he just tugged at different wires with his fingers and cleaned some contacts, and the problem went away for the most part. But really, if you make somebody an avionics inspector, they should have a pretty good fundamental knowledge of radios, electricity, magnetism, and this inspector apparently was just made an avionics inspector because he had experienced swapping radios when he was in the military. Not repairing them, just changing them from one plane to the other, putting in new ones. I doubt if he knew the difference between a football field and a magnetic field. Well, my concern was that if you're flying instruments and you can't see outside and you're relying on this to make a low approach, you could be well off course and collide with something. And the shops that I discussed this with said that this is not uncommon for that particular radio. Yet the FAA didn't want to do anything about this. I thought they should at least issue advisory circulars to other pilots. And we also have inspectors who I consider to be corrupt. For example, I was once a passenger on a Cessna 310 that had an inoperative fuel gauge. The pilot refused to write this up in his maintenance logbook and follow the inoperative equipment list for the inoperative fuel gauge. Probably would just say fill the tank that's associated with that gauge up all the way. So I contacted the FAA, and the local inspector seemed more like a loyal plantation servant trying to protect his master, rather than taking action against the air carrier for deliberately flying an airplane that was unairworthy. He simply said, well, it's probably a bad sensor in the gas tank that's causing the problem. Again, he's not supposed to be troubleshooting the problems for the airline. He's supposed to be trying to ensure that they comply with the regulations. Well, as mentioned previously, pilots were falling asleep at the controls of our aircraft, which was a Boeing 727. Once both pilots fell asleep at the same time, and I just simply controlled the plane from my flight engineer's seat by doing the radio work and changing the heading whenever it was necessary for about 20 to 30 minutes till one of them woke up. The main reason was the pilots were not getting the required rest. The regulations require that they get 8 hours of rest in a 24-hour period, and the required rest cannot be transportation which is non-local in nature. In other words, a short van ride to the hotel would be considered local in nature, and that would be counted part of their rest. But if they're flying to another city and the transportation is provided by the air carrier, then that is not considered local in nature. Okay, so let me get in a little more detail. The company made the homes of the pilots their domiciles, and every week they were switched to different cities to operate out of for their night flights. The company mainly just flew at night. And the company would say, take a jump seat on another air carrier a day ahead of time and we'll pay for your hotel. And that basically gave everybody sufficient rest according to the regulations. The only thing is, the air carriers that we jump seated on, they got wind of it and said, well, wait a minute. They're operating from their domiciles to another city to operate out of. That's really part of company business. And so jump seating is not designed to help a company perform its business. It's just designed to help the pilots get to work. And so they were in danger of losing their jump seating privileges because of this. And so then they had to buy everybody tickets. And we basically could leave a little later the afternoon of our flights often, sometimes the morning of our flights. The flights were typically at 7 in the evening. And so we weren't getting any hotel rest like this. And now, since the company was paying for the transportation, it was considered not local in nature. Again, transportation not local in nature provided by the air carrier is not allowable for the required rest. So to make a long story short, we'd have somebody leave at about noon from his home to go to a work site, maybe get there at 6 in the evening, and then his flight would be at 7. He'd fly from 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning, and the company says, okay, well, that's fine. You work 12 hours, you have 12 hours rest. However, the 6 hours that he spent traveling from his home to his work site was not travel local in nature. It was provided by the company. And so we basically having him work something like 18 hours in a 24-hour period and only have about 6 hours of required rest instead of the mandatory 8 hours. And when this is brought to the attention of the FAA, they refused action. They simply said, well, the pilots had the choice of leaving a day early, jump seating, and then being put up in a hotel by the company. Well, nothing in the regulations say that the required rest that's supposed to be exposed to not include transportation, not local nature, could be approved if a company's going to pay for your hotel. It's just that they're making excuses for the company, and this was contributing to a lot of people falling asleep. They're basically making up the rules as they go along. Well, there have been several accidents because of pilots falling asleep at the controls or not having sufficient rest. Let's say that they're contributing factors. One of them was Coletta Flight 808 in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It was in 1993. Another one was American Airlines Flight 1420, 1993. Corporate Airlines Flight 5966, 2004. Medair, 2004. Comair 5191, 2006. Colgan Air 3407, 2009. All where pilot fatigue was a contributing factor, to the best of my knowledge. Now, just as there are many good FAA inspectors, there are also many good what we call designated pilot examiners. These are not employees of the FAA, but they're allowed to issue pilot licenses and give flight tests. Some are very straightforward and they're a credit to the profession. Others are corrupt. The FAA sometimes has to revoke their examination authority. However, they refuse to say who these individuals are or how many designated examiners they revoke this authority from. But a lot of cases, the pilots who got their licenses through these corrupt examiners had to retake their flight tests. To give you an idea how bad this is, I'm going to read you an article from the National Association of Flight Instructors. This is by Robert M. Ritter. He says, I've been a CFI, that certified flight instructor, for over 30 years. During this time, I ran a flight school using my own aircraft. The FAA check ride process of using designated pilot examiners has become a very corrupt and vile system. The wait times for a check ride are now anywhere from a few months to even a year. The costs have gone up to $1,000 to $2,500 for a check ride, and the big flight schools are buying the designated pilot examiners that will pass their students. This is not to mention that the pilot examiners break many aircraft during the check rides and even have loss of control incidents, putting our students at risk. The FAA jumps in and manipulates the pass-fail rates at a whim, causing many students to have a failure on their record just to meet FAA-imposed standards on the designated pilot examiners. Just in 2017 to 2019, the Riverside Flight Standard District Office had just under 1,000 students fail their check rides under what may be false pretenses, costing these students thousands of dollars in retesting fees and maybe even their flying careers. It is time to fight for the CFIs to conduct the check rides. The process of licensing our pilots has gotten out of control. I would request that the leaders of the National Association of Flight Instructors read my article and then write a response to share with the aviation community. Where does the National Association of Flight Instructors stand on protecting our students? I will be taking this issue up with the FAA Administrator and with the Aviation Subcommittee. You may download my free article at aviatorsmarket.com. Just search Ritter and download under the documents. The video is on YouTube at captain.ritter, quote, that guy, quote, Ritter. Well, this parallels my experience as a flight instructor. One of my students was going for a multi-engine check ride in a Seneca, and the examiner on the ground said, "Your stall warning is not working." And he mentioned this to our director of maintenance, who was not the most tactful person. And our director of maintenance called the examiner an idiot, saying, "Don't you know the air ground sensing switch disables the stall warning when the plane's on the ground, when weight's on the landing wheels?" Well, that didn't go over very well with the examiner. It appeared that he just failed the student out of spite, claiming the student lacked proper system knowledge of the aircraft and also got too low on an instrument flight. However, I looked at the approach charts and found that the student was actually correct in his altitudes that he held. Part of the system knowledge failure was that the student did not lean the engines. However, that just further showed the examiner's lack of knowledge, because the only approved way to lean the mixture on the engines is by using the exhaust gas temperature gauges. And both exhaust gas temperature gauges were placarded inoperative on the plane. So per the manufacturer's operating manual, we could not lean the engines on that plane. I told the student, "You need to complain to the FAA about this, file a complaint," but he was afraid that there'd be repercussions against him. He wanted a career in the airlines and afraid of being blacklisted. So we just let it go, and today, 3 years later, he's a captain on a regional jet. I had another examiner have a student do maneuvers that were not in the practical test standards at that time. In other words, they weren't supposed to be part of the flight test, yet the examiner basically pulled them out of his rectum and had the student do that. I had the FAA basically give the student a retest on that, but that examiner was allowed to keep his examiner authorization for many years after that. Even though a colleague of mine told me that that examiner passed an incompetent student on his instrument check ride. The incompetent student happened to be the son of the owner of a flight school that gave that examiner a lot of students to give check rides to. So by passing the student, that examiner made the school owner happy and threw him a lot of business. Because of what I consider to be systemic corruption throughout the FAA at all levels, I think all FAA examiners and designated pilot examiners should be subject to polygraph tests to ensure that they are enforcing all regulations and that they're giving honest flight tests, not unnecessarily failing students and only passing students that are competent. Well, on the one hand, everybody should have a right to privacy. The public safety trumps that. So when you're working in the aviation industry, you should lose some of your rights to privacy in the interest of safety. One question I'd like to ask FAA supervisors is have they transferred anybody that has reported safety issues, transferred them or demoted them for simply reporting safety issues, like they did at Reagan National Airport. The final topic for this video will be the FAA airline transportation pilot written exam. It basically does not require the pilots to have sufficient knowledge. They basically can study for 30 hours and take the written exam, pass it. In Europe, it's a matter of studying for several months to take their airline transportation pilot exam. So that they learn a lot more in depth than in the United States. And subsequently, our captains often have a lack of knowledge that has contributed to accidents. Often, pilots in one European country can exchange licenses or do a minimal amount of work to have the license, let's say, from Greece to be turned into a license in Israel. However, they will not accept the United States licenses. One inspector in Israel in 1984 told me that the American FAA ATP written exam does not ensure a captain will have the required knowledge necessary to perform the duties of an air carrier pilot in command. That is Inspector Shorey. Currently, there's 120 multiple choice questions on the ATP written exam, and 70% is passing. And there's only like 3 choices you have, A, B, or C. So you're just by guessing, you're bound to get 1 out of 3 correct due to the law of probability. In other words, you're bound to get 33% by knowing nothing. So if you basically know 55% of the material, and then guess at the remaining 45%, you should get 15% of that by probability. Well, that 15% and the 55 that you really know add up to 70. You passed. You've become an airline transportation pilot. I say you're on your way to becoming one. You still have to pass the flight test. Unfortunately, there have been accidents due to lack of pilot knowledge. Let's look at one of them. Okay, on January 13th, 1982, an Air Florida 737 stalls on takeoff and crashes into a bridge at then Washington National, or near Washington National Airport. The pilot failed to de-ice the plane. Any pilot with any training knows that the plane will not fly with ice on the wings. He also failed to turn on his engine anti-ice. When your engine ices up, your power gauges, that's the engine pressure ratio gauges, will not be correct. And so you can't rely on that. And he basically had an iced up engine pressure ratio gauge, giving a false sense that he was developing full power, or at least takeoff power, when in actuality he was getting much less than that. A little bit of knowledge, further knowledge, would be that if you looked at his fuel flow, which you should do, you should observe about 9,000 pounds per hour on each engine. If you aren't getting that, then you aren't getting your full takeoff power. And there's also other things he could have detected, like if the plane's not accelerating well, that suggests you aren't getting power. He also tried to de-ice the plane by using reverse thrust on the ground. Anyway, it was one error after the other on his part. Another accident caused by lack of pilot knowledge. It would be Colgan Air Flight 3407, February 12th, 2009. The plane was making an approach into Buffalo, New York, with icing conditions. The plane's stick shaker started to vibrate, which is a warning that the plane is at too high an angle of attack. Pilot is supposed to reduce the angle of attack by lowering the nose. He does the opposite, stalls the airplane, and kills everybody on board. This pilot had a record of failing 3 previous check rides before that. And Hogan also says the pilots were failing to maintain enough attention on their flight instruments. So, again, these are just a few examples of pilots failing to have the proper knowledge to act as pilot in command, partially because any idiot and his uncle can pass the ATP written exam in the United States, in my opinion. Several other parts of this will be available shortly, probably either told with 4 or 5 parts. Thank you for watching. And I also urge you to contact your congressman to request that the FAA implement polygraph tests for everybody in the airline industry, whether they're inspectors, designated examiners, or pilots.